This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
So welcome all. I mean, there should really be thousands here this afternoon to listen to Anne. And I am, again, one of the absentees. In fact, I really was supposed to be somewhere else right now. But when Raphael reminded me that Anne had been invited, I thought at least I had, as director of the Warburg, to welcome her here. Because she is really the person we want to come to the Warburg. I mean, not just for an afternoon, but permanently. I think most of you know her work, presumably, but for those of you who don't, I just want to remind you that she should be here. In fact, I'm going to give you a whole lot of reasons why I think this. Just this afternoon, Raphael and I were having a conversation, and we were talking about the Institute and the library, and Raphael expressed various concerns about the state of the library and the Institute, and I said, but Raphael, the Institute is the library. You know, we've got all these other programs. I know they're MA students, I know they're PhD students, but even more important is the library, because they wouldn't be here if it weren't for the Warburg Library. So, you know, if you remember, Anne helped organize, I think she was the prime motor, the prima mobile, in a very, very, very famous conference at the Radcliffe Institute in 2010, which was entitled Why Books? And you know, if we are going to talk about the Warburg in the future, obviously this is a question which we have to ask ourselves. And as I've been saying to the whole world, including the Mellon Foundation, who are pushing more and more digital projects on us, more and more cyber stuff on us, I'm saying, look, if there's a future for the libraries, if there's an answer to the question, why books? We find it in the Warburg Library, both in the accessibility of the library, in the juxtaposition of old and new books, in the relationship with the archives, in the annotated books, in the collections of famous collectors, and in, of course, the famous classification system of A.B. Warburg. Now, Anne is the go-to person on all these topics. I mean, she may not have quite the bibliographic skills that Raphael has. I don't mean the librarianship skills. I'm sure you have the bibliographic, but the librarianship that Raphael has. But Anne is the go-to person for why books and why the Warburg Library should remain and why it serves as a model for the rest of the world. So that we need thousands of people, because I'm trying to be hortatory, as the Americans would say over here, so that the cash will start rolling in. And I look around. If any of you have deep pockets, please empty them in favor of the library. But then a few years later, before we get briefly to Anne's books, there was another famous conference at the Radcliffe Institute, which really now I'm bringing in the students who are here today, which some of you may remember is Take Note. And this wasn't just a pedagogical instruction to listen up, but she literally meant how people take notes on their work. So everything that Anne has done is relevant, directly relevant to the work of this institute. And that's really why I wish she were here, because there is no greater figure in terms of the history of the book, in terms of how knowledge is organized in books, how people reduce knowledge to more schematic formations, something, in other words, that relates, actually in printed ways, to the general problem of classification. I would say, you know, in some ways she's the Pierre de la Ramée, or Peter Ramos of the 21st century, except that she's much more interesting than Peter Ramos ever was. So, and you know, there are two great books which mark out her career. I thought she was the first student of Tony Grafton's, one of the big figures in our recent history, but she just told me she was the third student of Tony Grafton's, early enough. And I think it was your dissertation, Anne, which turned into the book on Bourdain. Now, most of us, I see David Chambers here, know about or think of Bourdain as a political philosopher, as a tough-headed political philosopher. But this book, which was really about Bourdain's Theatrum Naturae Universalis, is that right? I always get, because they're all Theatrum Totius Naturae. So, you know, but this was Bourdain as a natural philosopher. And so Anne here brought together the historian, the theorist of history, with natural philosophy in a way that established a reputation, established a reputation as someone who is deeply knowledgeable about the interactions between science, religion, and politics. And then, of course, came a very remarkable book about the management of knowledge, which manages too much to know. How we feel this today. There is too much to know. I mean, we feel this out of modesty, but whenever we enter a library now, or open a computer, there certainly is too much to know, and the subtitle is why I looked at Managing Scholarly Information Before the Modern Age. It's the central problem that we face. How do we manage scholarly information in our lives? I mean, in a way, of course, this anticipates the developments in Silicon Valley, but we as academics have faced this for some time. And so the question, which she raised there was the question of annotations, little scraps of paper, how they were put together into big books. She talked about diagrams, anthologies, these desperate attempts, some more desperate than others, to make information manageable. The book has been extraordinarily influential. I mean, some of you know, I worked at some earlier accumulations of knowledge. I started off with Aldrovandi, and now everybody knows about Aldrovandi, his desperate attempts to figure out ways of sorting out the whole world. These are books about sorting out information, and Anne has had the determination to try to figure it out. It's not always interesting, is it? It's not always interesting. I think Anne will testify this. It's not always interesting to read the quantities of information, the hierarchies that are set up, because at the bottom of the hierarchies things are can get pretty boring when they're not especially interesting. But at the same time, she writes in this spirited, engaging way, and she has made this topic a central issue in the history of ideas in our time. I should say that the book also, to some extent, reflects the ambition of our own scope here in the Institute, because it deals not only with the ways of organizing information in Western Europe, but across the globe. So she's even more necessary over here. I wish there were more people to listen to her. She has an amazingly engaging way of presentation. Somehow in our short conversation before we started, Anne managed to ask me a perfectly good art historical question, which was why they were sitting in different chairs. So I don't know whether this is capable of answering, but certainly makes you look, as all art historians should do, at the chairs. And we talked about the anthropomorphization of the head of the OG and this little fellow coming up here, which certainly didn't exist in the chair itself, but it exists in the book. And so here we return to what information and what more information we get from books. I think I mustn't walk off with your notes, Anne. But this is the Anne Blair who is going to talk to us this afternoon. We really, as I say, I think we should have transported her to the middle of next week's conference, which I hope you'll all attend. But in the meantime, let us, even though we are a small audience, give her a very large welcome. Thank you so much for coming. Raphael wanted to say, excuse me, Raphael wants to say a few words.
Of course, we are here today because we have been granted a small fund by the School of Advanced Studies. So we are funded today by the Castle Fund for French Studies, that you can imagine. I have discovered 2 years ago, and I'm trying to have money from this fund every year. So this year we will use it to host Anne Blair. I'm very lucky and I'm very honored because this is the second time that she accepts my invitation to talk. And she accepted to come to Lyon 6 years ago when she published her books. We organized a presentation of the book, Too Much to Know. It was very interesting because we were with specialists, with colleagues, specialists of information and library science and historians. All together we found a lot of things to say about these books, and I really think that everybody should read this book. Too much to know about this organization and scholarly knowledge. So thank you, Anne, for accepting my invitation. Once again, we will learn everything about this Gilbertus cognatus, which is here in this book. And again, I regret that we don't have a lot of audience, but it's a chosen audience.
Exactly. Quality, not quantity. This is great. No, thank you very much for coming. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. The first time I've been at the Warburg since something like 1984-85, when I was on an MPhil program in Cambridge and would come with great awe to these quarters, the Center of Renaissance Studies and Intellectual History in particular. Delighted to be here. So thank you for coming. And basically, I'm looking forward to having your suggestions and comments, because this is really work in progress, which grows out of a general project of mine, which actually grows out of Too Much to Know, which was about how do you make a big book in the Renaissance. And one of the punchlines is you don't make it alone. And in fact, even though these books are marketed under one person's name, there are many people working together. And I've been interested then in what I call amanuenses for short, the hidden helpers of intellectual work, basically in the sort of later humanist range, 1500 to 1650 or so. The role of them for scholars in particular, but also authors. And the representation of the author at work is precisely formed in this period, emphasizing the scholar alone with his books. Let me see here. I'm not going forward with that. Is this the method to go forward? No?
I think you have to close the menu first. Because
That's the problem. So what is this? Something got clicked here. There we go. No? Yeah. Get the slideshow. This works too. This works too. And now, great. There we go. Excellent. Okay. So first of all, it's not new to the early modern period that there are helpers or amanuenses. Certainly, basically, intellectual work in antiquity. We know about Cicero and Tiro. We know about Pliny and his assistants. In the Middle Ages, we know about Aquinas, of whom it is said that he could dictate to 3 or 4 secretaries at a time. And it turns out that is a trope of the great man. It's said of Julius Caesar, and it's said of Winston Churchill, to be able to dictate to many at a time. So I'm on the hunt for that trope. But I do think there are a couple things that make the early modern period especially interesting for studying this. One is, overall, the story is that the work of amanuenses is hidden and not brought to light. But in the early modern period, we start to have large collections of personal papers which survive, partly because paper becomes widely available and less expensive. That's largely driven by printing, which is driving the creation of paper, which is then available for other purposes. And so a collection of notes on paper will sort of survive much more readily than if you're taking notes on wax tablets or parchment slips and so forth. So these notes can often carry the sign of multiple hands at work. For example, just some British examples, Noel Malcolm shows how in the manuscripts of Thomas Hobbes, as he develops Parkinson's disease, his handwriting degenerates, and then suddenly there's a nice new handwriting that comes along, and this is when he hired the person who was originally his baker, James Weldon, to be his secretary. Or in Robert Boyle, who often in print complains of his eye ailments, Michael Hunter has identified 11 different hands throughout the manuscripts. So the survival of these manuscripts can show us that there are many people, although we often don't know more than that, or sometimes the occasional name. Another reason why the early modern period brings to light amanuenses in new ways, is that printing is a form of making public thanks, blame, credit in new ways, which puts pressure on authors. And in fact, the main way amanuenses appear in print is to bear responsibility for the bad parts of a book, right? You do not name them, that would be really invidious. You say, this edition is purged of the errors of the amanuenses. The errors of the amanuenses, please excuse the errors of my amanuensis. And it's very much not like today, all errors are my own and acknowledgements. There's this special category of person who is in charge of copying, And of course, that act of copying is license for correction. So the errors of the amanuenses are the whole source of classical philology and biblical philology, sort of authorizing the acts of correcting. There's another form, I don't know that I have it here, yes. Konrad Gessner, who is a Zurich naturalist of the 16th century, who is very defensive about how lengthy his books are, says, and he also always says he's very poor. So here he is explaining that you may find that some of these passages are verbose, but it's mostly in the beginning when I was relying on amanuenses in the plural. So he not only is not so poor that he can't hire people, but then here he's laying the blame for excess length on the amanuenses. Occasionally in print, though, you can find the author using the secretary as a mouthpiece. And here we have a nice example where Nicolas de Nancel, who's the biographer of Petrus Ramus, tells of the making of a polemical work by Ramus against Adrien Tournet, who had attacked him, that he wrote this brilliant diatribe, basically staying up all night, and it went to print with it immediately, but it was published under the name of another of his assistants. And Nancel, after the death of the two men, is revealing this as a great secret, a carefully held secret about who the true authorship of this book that went under the name of Omer Talon was actually by Peter Ramus. So that's a case, I think, of the author wanting what we would call today plausible deniability. You want to attack your enemy, but you don't want it to be under your name, and you can say, oh, if it doesn't go well, I had nothing to do with it. So those are some of the ways in which amanuenses actually appear in print, and in that case, ironically, where they didn't do the work, but they end up as the mouthpiece. The 17th century is also the appearance of explicitly collaborative works, and the term libri sociales is coined, to my knowledge, by Vincent Placius, one of these Historia Literaria people. But we have, the King James Bible doesn't advertise in the title page that's collaborative, but everybody knew 7 groups of 7 men who work together. The Magdeburg Centuries, also more of a hierarchical system of collaboration, which print can bring to light in interesting ways. And then what's really interesting too is here we have actually an amanuensis to the reader, which is a very unusual piece of paratext. So you can see it is a sort of antiquarian job of printing a bunch of medieval English histories. And we have to the readers by the 2 principal investigators, Roger Twisden and John Selden. And at the back of the book, we have Amanuensis to the Reader by Radolf Jennings, some of whose manuscripts still survive in the Bodleian, who presumably didn't even do all the work alone. It's a giant folio, but who basically is defensively, so proactively defending his work, that he checked everything very carefully and did all the proofs. And therefore, don't go accusing the amanuensis of any errors. He's done a good job. But so the final point I want to make that's new about the early modern period is the coining, I think, of this iconographic representation of the author alone in his study. And here I'm partly relying on the work of Gadi Al-Ghazi, who's done terrific work on the setting in which scholars portray themselves working, how that setting changes when scholars can marry, because of Protestantism and clerics can marry, or because of a broader range of people than clerics doing scholarship in the Catholic world. So here we have a Petrarch, which he attributes to Petrarch himself having designed this representation of himself in a study. Here we have many other early Renaissance interpretations. So if we look back, Jerome alone in his study, Augustine alone in his study, and I love what I think the idea is these are scratches of paper, right? This is the drafts that have been dropped to the floor. Of course, he wouldn't have been working in he probably wouldn't have been working with paper. That we know. He would have been working with parchment shards. And interestingly, there is one depiction of an ancient who is depicted with his secretaries. And so here is Pliny being commemorated in the late 15th century on the Cathedral of Como, the 2 Plinies, and each of them has a scene under them. And here is Pliny the Elder, and you can see his assistants. It's not quite clear what they're doing exactly, because, of course, Pliny the Younger describes the uncle as being read to at all times and often composing by dictation. And so, turning a bit to Erasmus now, one of the great productions of iconography of a scholar at work. This is the first Erasmus painting. Erasmus had a medal coined also by Quentin Matsys. And then there are something like 38 surviving Holbein portraits of Erasmus. Many more were made at the time. And apparently Holbein had a model that he could always whip out a new Erasmus portrait when Erasmus wasn't in town. So there's a huge industry. And how does Erasmus depict himself? He depicts himself with his own books. So the Labors of Hercules here is being alluded to, one of his adages, and here we have Lucian and the New Testament in the back. Here are other forms of sort of branding that Erasmus developed. His motto, Concedo Nulli. This was a Dürer portrait he was very pleased to have done, although apparently he didn't like it that much, but he was very impressed that Dürer had made it. Basically, then, the only time we see representations of amanuenses is in the negative vein. And this is from the book of The Dust Jacket of Too Much to Know, where you can see the scholar at work, but this is not a favorable depiction of the scholar. The place is a mess, it's got alchemical instruments, and the scholar is here in his armchair with a hat, but then there's a little guy who's sitting on a stool, no hat. This is the helper. And it's part of the negative iconography of this guy that he has a helper who's visible. Another great inspiration to my work is the work in History of Science by Stephen Chapin, who shows here in depicting the use of instruments, in particular the air pump, who's manipulating these instruments? Cherubim, right? No people. You don't show the technician. You absorb it into, these dials are being turned and cranks are being turned by invisible people. And then the scientist, or the gentleman, is here properly depicted. So I have a lot of tidbits from this project, and one of my challenges is drawing a bigger picture from it. One of the tidbits is from Montaigne's essays, where, interestingly, as you know, we have the Bordeaux copy, which is the 1588 edition, annotated in his hand, from which after his death the 1595 edition was produced. And of course, most of Montaigne's editions are about adding. And yet here's one passage that was removed from 1588 to 1595, and therefore does not end up in Montaigne translations typically, because it's not the last version of the author. What does this passage tell us? He explains that he had written something on armor, comparing French armor to Roman armor, and here the bolded part, but this scrap of my notes having been stolen from me with several others by a man in my service, I will not deprive him of the profit he hopes to make from it. And I won't chew over the same meat twice. So basically, I'm not going to rewrite this stuff on armor, but his fear was that his servant had stolen and was trying to sell off this piece of Montaigne's writing. It never came to light. Maybe there were illusions on Montaigne's part, on the servant's part. But clearly then this mention of a servant as being part of the composition, or at least in close contact to his manuscript, is something erased, which I find interesting. That Montaigne himself, perhaps, on second thought, decided to drop it. Here we have another example of a servant appearing in print. And this is from Pontus de Thiard, who has a book on the right imposition of names in 1591. And I owe this to Jean Séard, who made an edition of this work. And it's a fascinating story about how he's working in the summer of 1591 with a learned man and his secretary bursts in. He says, "I have, my master, something that you could please add to your little work on the right imposition of names, which you've given me to transcribe. Here is a perdicite." These are these stones that are born in the gullet of a partridge, which I pulled with my own fingers from the gullet of partridge, served to us from the remains of your meal. So we get a little sense of how the servant is eating. And the servant, realizing he's been copying a passage, says, "Please, could you include it in your book, that I found this?" And of course, the Pontus de Thiard said, "Oh, you're joking." And then the servant says, "I assure you what I declare is the truth. I split the gullet of the bird, and this valet and other domestics can attest to this." And then Pontus de Thiard says, "Sure, fine. I believe you. You've convinced me." And this passage then ends up in print. Right? So the servant's intervention into the book, knowing what he was talking about in his copying work, has contributed a tidbit, and then it's cited. So the attraction of the case of Gilbert Cousin is that instead of having servants' voices mediated through the masters, Cousin actually was the next to last amanuensis of Erasmus and went on to quite a long and prolific career as a humanist himself. So here is where he's from, Nozeroy in Franche-Comté, and this town actually looks, this is sort of from my travels, and here you can see a map depiction that he made of the town going the same direction with the top clock tower and the Biblioteca Gilberti Cognati represented in there. Here's a model of the town that you can find in the town, from the clock tower down to the castle, and the Maison Cousin is around here. And here's a map of it, and here is the bibliothèque, formerly the library, and then here is the house of Gilbert Cousin, and you can get a nice plaque. Dans cette maison vécut Gilbert Cousin, écrivain et humaniste, secrétaire d'Erasmus. And that is, of course, how he's remembered. It's also the source of my interest in him. But I did title my thing about the impact of Erasmus on the life of Cousin, although we will discuss the converse, because I'd like to try and see what a secretary's life looks like on its own terms. Basically, we have one secondary source. Lucien Febvre wrote a 1907 article in the Bulletin de la Société du Protestantisme Français, which tells you something about how he's been classified. It's a sad story, as Febvre casts it, of a man who, after leaving Erasmus's employ, goes back to his hometown in Nozeroy, sets up a humanist school, which is fairly successful, of lots of kids from Basel, actually, sons of people he knew there while he worked for Erasmus. And then, though, is a sort of an Erasmian humanist caught in 3 successive waves of Counter-Reformation activity in the area, the last of which lands him in jail on suspicion of heresy in 1567, and he dies under some form of house arrest before conviction in 1572. So it's a terrific article, but Febvre sees this as a tragic story, as his failure to, he didn't stay with Erasmus right down to his death, and he lost the opportunity really to live, to stay in Basel and be a humanist there. He's then therefore isolated. I do have it on the map here. Nozeroy is a little teeny place. You have to draw it on the map these days. So Cousin was from Nozeroy. He did his university studies in law first and then theology at Dole. And then he probably went to the University of Basel. The second person who's worked on this is Peter Bietenholz in his book on Basel and France in the 16th century, devotes much of a chapter on Burgundy and Basel to Cousin, who single-handedly accounts for pretty much all the Burgundy-originated imprints published in Basel in the 16th century. And after Cousin's death, there is no longer a special connection between Burgundy and Basel. But there were students who traveled back and forth, certainly through Cousin's time. And we don't know exactly how Erasmus and Cousin met up with one another. It has been suggested perhaps Cousin was aggressively went to Freiburg, where Erasmus was in 1530 when he started working for him. Erasmus left Basel because he felt it was dragging him, associating him too closely with Reformation. And so he spent 5 years in Freiburg, or 6, from 29 to 34. And it's possible also that Amerbach, whom Cousin refers to as his teacher, brokered this relationship, or this relationship may have been brokered by another Burgundian or two, Louis de Vere, who was a relative of Cousin's, or François Beauvalot, who were also correspondents of Erasmus. We just don't know how it happened, but by 1533, Erasmus is singing the praises of his fidèle fameux, who has been working for him for 3 years. So we do have timing there, and we have this engraving, which Cousin makes. You can see how it's very different from Erasmus engraving himself at work, which is with his own books. Cousin commemorates his relationship with Erasmus in print in 1553. Interestingly, when you go to Nozeroy, you learn that there is an oral tradition that there was a fresco in the kitchen of the Maison Gilbert Cousin with this image in it. So that Cousin would have represented this relationship in his kitchen, and then he copies that painting into this booklet, which of course he authored this booklet. And it I think we should think of it as an idealization, just as Erasmus's images of himself are an idealization. What it idealizes is, of course, no hierarchy, which is very striking there. I was asking David Friedberg about the chairs, whether he saw one chair was less good than the other. They're both wearing hats. Erasmus is wearing fur, which is more expensive. Erasmus is 70 years old, as depicted here, and Cousin is 26, so he worked with Erasmus until he was 31, and Erasmus 75, and Erasmus died 1 year later. I'll return to this and what it tells us a bit. What we do know more about, so here actually, sadly, this is not the house where Erasmus worked with Cousin, because that house has become a shopping area. But this is another house that Erasmus lived in first when he moved to Freiburg, Haus zum Walfisch, which was actually meant for imperial ambassadors, and Erasmus negotiated to stay in it when he first came to Freiburg, but then he didn't like it, and so on. So we have a little tidbit there. What we do know more about is how Cousin and Erasmus broke up, because there are a fair number of letters back and forth. So first of all, we have a thank you letter here in December 1534, basically saying, in the meantime, let's see, he's saying, thank you so much. I was unanimously elected canon of Saint-Antoine in Nozeroy. He says, no place is more pleasant, nor more salubrious. My plan is to found an academy, which he does. If only we could have you here so we could philosophize together. Here we are, more in person, and he calls him incomparable patron. So indeed, Erasmus has written a couple of letters of support. Cousin has landed his dream job in his hometown. And the key then, of course, is where is he going to hold that job? And for a while, he's able to hold it in absence, and he stays. Meanwhile, Erasmus has moved to Basel. But then he leaves. In fall of 35, he leaves Erasmus' side and goes back to Nozeroy. And so here we have him in two very rhetorical letters, which were published twice by Cousin, which Alan wonders if they were ever actually sent, or at least sent in this wording. And he's basically saying that he regrets having left. Erasmus, most erudite of all, in your benevolence, remember your client, your protege, who's attached to you in all things, so that if one day he had some right to himself, he would transfer it all to you. I desire to be and to be called your property. I have some interesting adventures here with the online Allen letters. They have used some kind of character recognition, and they're peppered with little typos. So, that's one of them, I would say, just a warning. So he's, at the one hand, he's not where Erasmus wants him to be, which is in Basel with him, and on the other hand, he's saying, I am your property, I am yours. So obviously, it's a rhetorical stance, which differs from his physical one. Here we have, there is nothing so hard or difficult. If there's something in my power to do, as Homer says, if it's already been done, in which you would not have my obedience. Love your most loving amanuensis in return as you do. Do not cease to bestow your favor. So obviously he's hoping to stay friends with Erasmus, and Erasmus writes back, and he has two sides to this. He's got the lure, and then he's got the sort of the angry bit. So basically he's writing back in March 36, please come back. I'll just talk about the bold part. I would receive you like a friend as you desire. You would have less work, and you would feel my generosity more liberally. And if something should happen to me, care would be taken that a portion not to be scorned would come to you, as in my will, if I should die, I think. As it happens, Erasmus did not leave anything to Cousin in his will, and Cousin was disappointed in that. But of course, Erasmus was disappointed that Cousin did not come back. In fact, we have another letter where Cousin promises to come back in the fall of 36, but Erasmus dies in July of 36. Now, whether he would have, who knows? Money clearly played a role in this decision, I would think. And I want to just situate Cousin among the other amanuenses of Erasmus. Very nice book by France Bierler, maps out all of the guys he hired. You can see that sometimes he's got up to 8 people working for Erasmus at the same time. Erasmus is, as you know, a monastic who left his order but never married. He had a woman, Margaret, who's here. I'm going to move to the second part, so this is the later part. Margaret ran his household, and all these are men who work for him for a certain amount of time. Some of them go on to marry. Some of them, like Cousin, go into a nice job, a benefice in his hometown. Why would you not take that? So here is Cousin, one of the longer lived ones. After Cousin's death, one Comans takes over, who does get a large lump sum of 200 florins for faithfulness down to Erasmus's death. So let's talk a bit about money and how amanuenses are paid. There's a huge variation, obviously, and I've been using the term amanuensis. Helpers come in many forms, and Raphael has studied some wonderful family helpers, sons and grandsons of Vittori who work with him, for example. There are also daughters, famously Milton's daughters. There are wives. Aldovrandi was mentioned earlier. Francesca Aldovrandi is the only woman I've ever seen sign off on a major folio Latin text. After the death of Ulisse, she addresses the Senate of Bologna saying, please remember all the things my husband has done for you. As in, yes, send down some money. So, but with Cousin we have a famulus, right, a servant. And so there is no family relationship. The blur between a pupil and a servant is a fine line, and there's a lot there's no single term. I'm using amanuensis, but many terms are used. There's much more of a concept than a single term. So how is the intellectual famulus paid? And so there's not a whole lot. There are manuals on how to run a noble household. And there's one, for example, that I looked at from 1697. And among the 31 to 37 servants you should budget for, there's only one secretary. And that person is basically middling, on a par with the cook, less than the master of stables, but more than the valet or the porter in terms of how he's paid. But obviously the Scali household is a special kind of household. It's not covered, the 8 amanuenses. How are they living? We know, for example, from Thomas Hobbes I mentioned, James Weldon, the baker, kept accounts, so we know what he was paid. And basically, he received gifts once a year, and basically, or twice a year, £5, so £10 per year, which seems to be a standard wage for mid-level servants, and this would be the mid-17th century. But you can see the notion of the gift. Then we should think about how Erasmus was paid, and we have a very nice article by OU on that. And in fact, Erasmus is paid mainly by gifts. He earned an excellent living after basically the adages came out in 1508. He received gifts of patronage in money and kind, silver cups, gold clocks, silverware, vases, and he makes most of his money in lump sums, from presenting copies of his works to important people by using friends to approach the great man at the right time when he's in a good mood to maximize the possible revenue. So it's not surprising then that the way he seems to pay his helpers is through lump sum gifts. Basically, these are live-in, and so they're getting free room and board, and probably laundered, and some basic clothes, hand-me-downs from the masters, typically. And Erasmus, of course, we're looking at the period when he is the most famous humanist in Europe. We have young men throwing themselves at him, wanting to work for him, and that's very possibly how Cousin started off, that Cousin just went to Freiburg and said, hire me. We don't know exactly how that works, but we certainly have other letters of young men who approach Erasmus offering their services. So basically, when you enter in this kind of relationship, it's much more of an apprenticeship. You maybe are not expecting to get cash. We do know, for example, though, that Erasmus gave one another amanuensis, Quirinus Talesius, 150 crowns in 1529 to thank him for, quote, several years of good service. Or when, we saw that sentence, when Erasmus is trying to lure Gilbert Cousin back, he says, I will be more generous with you. So he's basically offering a greater share of any gifts that come up. Amanuenses are making money, though. Erasmus is someone who, people want access to, and the amanuensis, of course, can place a good word. So here we see a receipt. This is in the papers of the Universitätsbibliothek in Basel, where Cousin acknowledges receiving from Erasmus 10 florins on the condition that if Augustinus, and I have not identified who the guy is, were to send a gift to Cousin, Erasmus would collect it. So in other words, the master doesn't want the secretary double dipping. He'll pay the secretary for his share, But if the secretary gets something directly, it should come to the master and pay him back. So similarly, we have a Johann Koller, a satisfied dedicatee of one of Erasmus's works, who writes in 1535 to Erasmus to thank him for dedicating his Responsio to him. Quote, I owe much on that account to your Gilbert cousin, who suggested me to you as a dedicatee. I will make sure to pay the debt I owe him. So that's where Koller was telling the master, okay, you know, I'm grateful to cousin, I'm going to pay cousin. So then Erasmus doesn't, this is what this is trying to prevent, right? That if Erasmus knows that Koller's paying cousin, then Erasmus doesn't have to pay him. When your ship comes in, basically, when someone has been happy with the result of something. So proper courtier behavior keeps the master informed. Yeah, good. So what does cousin do? Most of Erasmus's correspondence actually is autograph. Here we see classic letter to Basil Ammerbach. There are tons and tons of these letters. Of course, they're all in print now with Allen, and now online even. Here you can see a contrast between the inside of the letter and the outside of the letter. So who has this nice handwriting? Who's putting the envelope? That's cousin. And this is Erasmus. So cousin is addressing the envelope, but not writing the letter. We have a few letters in cousin's hand. We have 3 of them that I'm aware of. And this one is a nice case. You can see it's much different handwriting, very, very nice hand. That will clearly, the secretary's selling point is the beauty of his hand. And what this is a copy of a letter to Sadoleto, which Erasmus wants to send to Ammerbach. So cousin has copied the letter, Erasmus is signing, but he doesn't sign actually, it's like in cousin's hand. And then cousin has a little note to Ammerbach, with whom he had an independent relationship, calling Ammerbach his teacher, although we don't know the details of that. And then here, there's a little sign explaining that Erasmus is suffering from chiragra, or gout in the hands. So that's why Erasmus isn't writing any of this. And cousin signs off, your very devoted Gilbert cousin. Yeah, the quality didn't come out so well in blowing it up, sorry about that. So that's one example. Another letter that is written in cousin's hand is to the Pope. And I wonder here if there is some protocol that when you write up the social hierarchy, you use your secretary. James Daybell has some very nice work on handwriting and autography in letters in England. And he talks about how you autograph letters across to your friends. And you use your secretary for up and down letters. And of course, yeah, so there's a whole protocol. If you're really close to the Queen, an autographed letter to the Queen means you are, you know, in that favored circle of friends and family. Otherwise, you use your secretary to write to someone up. Yeah, and there's the envelope for that one. And here's another letter that's autographed, is to Peter Tomiczki in Poland, where he explains that, this one I don't have a picture of, I just have the Allen. He explains that I dictated these because my right hand has so much gout that I can hardly close my hands on a quill. And then he signs off. And then again, he has like a PS where he apologizes for, please, forgive the fact that another man I've written in a foreign hand because my right hand is so bad that I can't even sign. And instead of the sign, I'm using my seal, the terminus. Remember that symbol that he used. And then he says, because something is badly written by my amanuensis, the cause is the haste of the messenger who didn't let him write it over again. So here he's not blaming the amanuensis for the poor copy. He's saying, forgive the amanuensis, which is actually cousin, although he's not named in the letter. He's explained the guy was rushed, and so he wasn't able to make a clean copy. So there's a certain amount of copying, although not as much as you'd think. So Erasmus is not composed by dictation, at least his letters. Here, though, what is happening is dictation. You can see the raised hand of Erasmus on the right, the copying of cousin on the left. People have commented also that these are the books. The books are here as if cousin is sort of in charge of the library or managing the stuff. I do not know. I love this flower metaphor. You see people drawing together from the same model in Fuchs. but of course Fuchs is later. Fuchs may be inspired by this, I'm not sure. This is a very hard to find plaquette, a little pamphlet, where this is the centerfold. And the thing is full of odes of praise to Cousin, by his friends, to Erasmus, by Erasmus's friends, and so on. And also it timed with the publication of Cousin's probably first big book, which was a description of Burgundy. So here is the book, the Effigies. The title of the book is a picture of Erasmus and Cousin. And then inside we get a picture of Cousin. And we have on some of the pages we have a sort of a poem about how Cousin worked. And in particular then, just as Cousin was once to Erasmus alive, so now too in pious death. Just as he filled the thirsty sheets under the dictation of the master, thus he gathered selected loci. That was a labor of piety and endless study. This a labor of true religion and firm love. And then it goes on to say, similarly, on the indexes of Gilbert Cousin and all the Opera Omnia of Erasmus, which Erasmus wrote, Conatus makes everyday things known in the index. Read this, you studious youth of Latin eloquence. Without doubt, part of the work will be of good use to you. So what the poem refers to then is taking dictation and then indexing or collecting loci seem to be all included there. Here indeed we have, now these are other amanuenses of Erasmus. We have an index of the adages of Erasmus, and you can see two hands. You can see this hand, who's that? Erasmus, and you can see this hand, very nice metallic. This one is Nicholas Canius, earlier in Erasmus's career, but still has that nice secretarial hand. And here we have Canius annotating with Erasmus in a book. Erasmus, Canius. These pages aren't facing each other. Most of the annotations are little things like proofreadings. And that's clearly done by the amanuensis in the main. So the book, the copy of this and the Basel Library is stuffed full of manuscript additions. You can see here, this is Cousin's own motto, just like Erasmus had the Terminus. He has Prudence, and basically it's the snake and the eagle, which I think is a reference to a verse of Matthew. And you can see many different unused, things that are not printed, added in interleaved pages, and then some printed poems and reminiscences. So Cousin was ready to create a new edition of this Effigies, although it never appeared in print. There are lots of Cousin manuscripts in the University of Basel. You can see a guy who printed a ton and who was ready to print many more things. So here's his big book on Burgundy, which has the picture of Nozeroy that I showed you. His earliest work is a book about the office of the servant, published in Basel and in Paris in 1535, although here it says Subscuto Basiliensi, so obviously some kind of partnership. And then it was published in German, 2 different translations, and in English, with a typo in the date, because it actually does not predate the Latin, it postdates the Latin. It's interesting that it's sort of slightly disappointing text. It does not talk at all about kind of intellectual help. But it has all the sort of basic advice about hiring a servant, make sure they're honest, that they don't drink, that they don't womanize, and so forth. It ends with this vivid image of the ideal servant who has a red cap, which means he's well dressed, has a pig's snout, meaning that the servant is content with everything, has ass's ears, which means patience, and has the hand held up in uprightness, as a sign of uprightness. So it ends with a verbal image, which then is given a sort of iconographic form in this German translation. But this is actually a very popular work. So now I'm moving on into Cousin's life after Erasmus. He wrote this with Erasmus, or under his employ, and then everything else he writes afterwards. He was a prolific guy. His bibliography is very complicated. I'm currently around 60 works. They're mostly short. They're almost all octavos. Some of them in later editions become 16mos, so really short, cheap works. And what's fascinating about them is they don't survive very well, actually. We have autobibliographies by Cousin in manuscript in Basel and in print. And a lot of those works I still haven't tracked down. And then we have manuscripts that he didn't actually print. So here are a couple of them. So here is, basically a formula for honest living by Martin. This is Bishop Martin. We can see he's dedicated to someone whom he knows. And then, whenever he can, here he has a judgment by Erasmus on this work. So this is published well after Erasmus's death, who died in 36. This is 45. And yet, whenever Cousin can, he will invoke. Now, where he's getting this Erasmus's judgment, I don't know. It's as if he had the stock of Erasmus's, table talk, or that he pulls out at every opportunity. Here we have inside his opera, to that work he adds something that wasn't there earlier. It's a list of basically, axioms or sort of adages, basically. And here, restituted by Erasmus. Why? I don't know what ground Cousin has for saying this, or maybe it's just a way of adding authority to what's his own work. He has a couple folio works. So here is one on law, and you can see with a very nice dedication to two Burgundians who went to school with him, Metellus and Rosarius. And this is the only case of editio princeps, where Cousin has published the sermons of a Merovingian bishop. And it's the only work of Cousin's which has a privilege. So we can see and it's a folio too. Actually, I'm not sure about that. But nonetheless, at the end of his life, Cousin manages to publish in 3 folio volumes of a total of quite a number of pages, which was condemned by the Council of Trent, as we know, since he ran into trouble, his Opera Omnia. And you can see here, it starts with his insignium and his portrait, and these are the contents listed of the Opera Omnia, 48 items, most of which had been previously published. Now, interestingly, so the way Bietenholz and most everybody presents this is this was a gift by Operinus, because Operinus' son was one of the Basel boys who was in Cousin's school in Nozeroy. So he went to high school with Nozeroy, and so the dad does him a favor. On the other hand, there's a passage inside the book, see here after these poems. Here, Gilbert Cousin to Henrik Petri, the printer. See how much you are with me, Adam. I send you to print this volume in which you will make no small gain. Indeed, I owe no less to you than men will owe me that I publish this again. Well, they know I did this for your cause especially, to help a pupil. This is a learned, abundant work full of pleasure, very useful for the preparation of eloquence and the cultivation of good morals, made from most proven authors, especially Seneca. Oh, that's the wrong quote. Sorry about this. I got myself fouled up here. Well, basically, what's fascinating about this passage is that he is saying, I'm sure you will select with prudence these epigrams and remove the barbs from them. Because nowadays people will be irritated by the slightest thing, which is fascinating. It makes us feel like that time is not so, in that very religious touchiness, I think is what he's concerned about. However much I wanted to, another advice came into mind. Nonetheless, I make sure that I have this plan to prepare something else to put in public, but, and I ordered from Operinus that I got from Operinus that he not republish the Laconicarum Ferraginés. And I went over them, removing a few things and mitigating others insofar as possible. So he's saying basically that you better be careful in publishing this. I am worried about things that are uncorrected by me or that are in these difficult times. And in a way then, who's doing a favor to whom here? Is it really that Operinus, or Henrik Petri actually, is doing a favor to Cousin, or is Cousin doing a favor to him? I don't think it's clear. I mean, I cannot believe these Basel printers are not printing things that they expect to make money from, and in fact, they go through multiple editions. And therefore, they are doing this out of self-interest, among other things. They're cultivating relationships. Of course, there's a tremendous amount of sort of mutual reinforcement through odes of praise, dedications, and so forth. And yet, I'm not willing to think that this 3-volume folio is only, as a favor to Cousin, who then is worried and telling you, select. Of course, isn't it a sign that the selection was poorly made that this ends up in print? Surely, Cousin enjoining the printer to be careful in what he prints is not intended for print. So the printer is just sort of throwing a lot of things into print for whose benefit is not entirely clear. Oh yeah, here we go. I do not doubt your prudence has selected only those epigrams which have no barbs. I would have wished that another plan had come to your mind than printing this, and that he had to talk down Operinus to not republish the Faragines. Yeah, there we are. So what is Erasmus, how is Cousin operating? Basically, he's in the greater Erasmus circle. At Erasmus's death, this catalog of Erasmus's worth is published with epitaph after epitaph. And it's interesting, I don't know about the hierarchy. So here we have, I just gave you a couple pages here. So-and-so N from Brabant, Nicolas Bourbonius, Jean Morel, another one. And then we have Gilbert Cousin, who gets in his epitaph, and then we have 2 printers, Froben and Episcopius, who get in their epitaph. So that is on, it says Finis right here. It actually is the next to last page, because the very last page is Sebastian Münster in Hebrew, which is obviously, a knockdown, drag out. I'm not going to, I can't read it. So that's how the book actually ends. But is being on the next to last page or the last page pride of place? Being combined with printers, is this a sign of where he belongs in the social hierarchy of sort of this helpmeet? I don't know. I honestly don't know. We've already seen how Cousin invokes Erasmus in his print whenever he can, with or without reason, I'm not so sure. He carries on an abundant correspondence after Erasmus' death with Amerbach in particular. He also gives books to people, in particular to Amerbach. So here we have these inscriptions to Amerbach, my preceptor and patron. So this was actually possibly given in the time when, as a gift, it says, as a gift. Here's another one also to Amerbach. Here is one given to an adolescent, a young man, but you can see the name has really been cut out, so we cannot identify to whom he gave it. Now that's his own work. He's probably giving that to a pupil. We can see this is how he's circulating things through a letter. This is a letter of Cousin to Gessner, and he says, I've added Hugo of Sax's on the nature of animals. And so we don't have that insert to the letter, but obviously he added a manuscript. He says here, Calamo scriptum. And actually, Conrad Gessner, being who he is, always uses the backs of letters and stuff. So the back of the letter, here's the address, but the rest of it has Gessner's own notes and stuff. In the epitome of Gessner's Bibliotheca, which is not by Gessner, in fact, it was a sort of unauthorized printing, we have a Paralipomena, which is sort of an appendix at the end of the alphabetical list of all the works, published in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, is the idea of the Bibliotheca. He has this saying, now, when the book was almost mostly printed, we received a catalog of authors by the most learned Gilbert Cousin. And we didn't want to defraud the readers of this goodies. So here we add them. They're not in the right place, obviously. It's an alphabetical list of 4 pages of works that Cousin contributed information about. And the Cousin article in the Bibliotheca is considerable. Of course, Cousin supplied all that information. It's one of the autobibliographies that I have to work with. So we can see how Cousin is a passer of information. And I just want to close by contrasting briefly. He's a broker of information. Conrad Gessner is a guy I've worked on, and of course he's a great humanist, right? They're exact contemporaries, and they knew each other. They corresponded with each other. So what's the difference between Cousin and Gessner? Gessner also published 60-plus books. Gessner's books has many more folios than Cousin has. He has many more ediciones principes. He works with manuscripts in a way that Cousin does not. Gessner had the great good fortune, I would say, of working in medicine. Cousin, by choosing theology at this time in particular, is extremely narrowly constrained by what he can say, and even, unfortunately, didn't constrain himself enough. And so most of his writings are what we'd call sort of pious pap. I mean, they are very repetitive and predictable. And they're long-winded, and there are sermons, and there are orations on the death of Christ and the birth of Christ, and there are lots of pedagogical exercises. But they both are information brokers. They both operate in the same ways, through letters, through plenty of publications. They both are people who have manuscripts just stuffed in there, available for printing at any time. Cousin has tons of works, not only that aren't his, he has his own works, but then he has little bits of things in other people's works, which is also the case with Gessner. Gessner publishes a book that has 10 different items in there. They're miscellanies, really, that end up in print. We think of the miscellany as this medieval manuscript phenomenon, but this Basel world, at least, is full of miscellaneous works that are printed. But I suppose the big difference is Gessner draws from a European, has some very, he draws correspondence from all over Europe, whereas Cousin is very much Burgundy and Basel. He does not have geographic breadth. He's always doing small formats, and rarely with privileges. No images except for the ones I showed you, whereas, of course, Gessner gets the investment of his printers into very expensive images. And what results then is much less survival. Most of Cousin's works are hard to find, and I think there's some that probably are completely lost. Whereas Gessner's works are not only all survived, but they are also all available online now, thanks to eRara. Although some of Cousin's works are also available on eRara. So it's fascinating to think about the difference between a top-tier humanist and a second-tier or third-tier. They share many modes of operation, and yet the scale in which they operate, the field in which they work, have impacts on their success. So I will stop here, and I look forward to your comments and suggestions. I hope I made some sense, and I have more images if you're interested in response to questions. Thank you.